As we saw, by 1913, the war on the bankers wasn't going so well for the kings of Wall Street. But as winter would set in and the year would come to a close, the bankers were about to get the ultimate Christmas gift, a gift that would keep on giving. From the Rochester Sentinel out of Indiana on Tuesday, December 23, 1913, we see a subheadline, Currency Bill Up to President. President Wilson's bill for the reform of the banking and currency systems of the country will become law late today. Both houses of Congress passed the measure. And from the Evening News, over in California, on the same day, their subheadline reads, Wilson currency measure to become law at 6 o'clock. By a vote of 32 to 25, the Senate this afternoon approved the Conference Committee report on the administration currency bill. The measure was sent to President Wilson for his signature. It will be signed by the President at 6 o'clock this evening. When the Senate debate began, Senator Bristow, Republican of the Banking Committee, began an attack on the measure to get his opposition in the permanent record. He had not been permitted to address the Conference Committee. He declared that the plan to have the new system organized by the Secretaries of Agriculture and Treasury and the Controller of the Currency was an effort to get the whole system under political control. Then we see on Wednesday, December 24th, 1913, the law has been accepted, he said, in a thoroughly patriotic manner, and that was William McAdoo, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. I have never had any doubt, and have none now, that most of the national banks of the country will enter the new system. I believe it will prove an unexpected success, and the greatest thing that has happened to the country in many years. And the law that went into effect on December 23, 1913, under its short title, was called the Federal Reserve Act. As soon as practical, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Comptroller of the Currency, acting as the Reserve Bank Organization Committee, shall designate not less than 8 nor more than 12 cities, to be known as Federal Reserve Cities. This was the creation of what we know today as the United States Federal Reserve System, which is the United States' central banking system. Then we see on Friday, December 26, 1913, scores of banks seek entrance to system. More than 400 national banks and trust companies representing every state and almost every large city in the country have applied for membership in the Federal Reserve System of banks, according to an unofficial estimate made today by the Treasury Department. So basically what you have here is all the banks are tripping over themselves in a rush to give the control of your hard-earned cash over to the bankers on Wall Street. Let's have a look at how the Federal Reserve was created to begin with. The mustachioed man in the silk top hat strode to his private rail car parked at a New Jersey train station, a mahogany-paneled affair with velvet drapes and well-polished brass accents. 5 more men and a legion of porters and servants soon joined him. They referred to one another by their first names only, an uncommon informality in 1910, intended to give the staff no hints as to who the men actually were, lest rumors make their way to newspapers and then to the trading floors of New York and London. One of the men, a German immigrant named Paul Warburg, carried a borrowed shotgun in order to look like a duck hunter, despite never having drawn a bead on a waterfowl in his life. Within a couple of days, this group of men, with Paul Warburg included, boarded a boat for the final leg of their journey, Jekyll Island, and a private resort owned by J.P. Morgan. For 9 days, working all day and into the night, the 6 men debated how to reform the U.S. banking and monetary systems, trying to find a way to make this nation just finding its footing on the global stage, less subject to the kinds of financial collapses that had seemingly been conquered in Western Europe. Secrecy was paramount. Discovery, wrote one attendee later, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would have been wasted. If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. And remember, this was in 1910, November 10th to November 20th to be precise, as we'll see. And the Washington Post goes on to list some of the reasons behind the creation of the Federal Reserve, including the Panic of 1907. And if you look up the Federal Reserve on Wikipedia, you'll see they say the Federal Reserve was created after a series of financial panics, particularly the Panic of 1907. It started with a devastating earthquake in San Francisco in 1906, which hit the insurance companies really hard, starting a domino effect, turning into the Panic of 1907. Then the Washington Post tells us about the power of J.P. Morgan. It is true that the United States, in that fearful fall of 1907, didn't have a central bank. That doesn't mean it didn't have a central banker. John Pierpont Morgan was, at the time, the unquestioned king of Wall Street. And they note down below, two of the most important financial firms in America today, J.P. Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley, trace their lineage to John Pierpont Morgan. When the 1907 crisis rolled around, Morgan held court at his bank's offices at 23 Wall Street, while a series of bankers came to make their requests for help. Morgan asked the Treasury Secretary to come to New York. Note who summoned whom, and ordered a capable young banker named Benjamin Strong to analyze the books of the next big financial institution under attack, the Trust Company of America, to determine whether it was truly broke or merely had a short-term problem of cash flow, the old question of insolvent versus illiquid. Merely illiquid was Morgan's conclusion. The bankers bailed it out. And generally, J.P. Morgan is hailed as being the hero that saved the country from the panic of 1907. And if we have a look at the jpmorgan.com website, under the history section, they tell us, in October 1907, J. Pierpont Morgan summoned New York City's major financiers to his library on East 36th Street. The situation was grim. The crisis was global. With no central bank, J.P. Morgan & Company was the only institution with the experience and authority to act. J. Pierpont Morgan helped to save several trust companies and a leading brokerage house from insolvency, bailed out New York City, and rescued the New York Stock Exchange. Now let's have a look at a little bit of history that the Washington Post and jpmorgan.com and others don't bother to tell us about. From the Nevada Daily Mail on June 14, 1912. Panic stopped by U.S., not Morgan. 25 million put on stock exchange out of Treasury. Evidence intended to show that the $25 million which J.P. Morgan has been generally credited with placing upon the New York Stock Exchange during the Panic of 1907 was really supplied by the Treasury of the United States, was introduced today at the hearings of the Pujo Committee of the House of Representatives that is investigating the so-called money trust. From the New York Sub-Treasury, the attorney secured a statement showing that on the day, October 24th, on which Mr. Morgan told R.H. Thomas, president of the exchange, to announce the $25 million loan to the exchange loan brokers, the government had deposited with the banks nearly $29 million. Now, as far as the money that was loaned to the stock exchange, the total amount agreed to was $23,550,000, but the amount actually loaned, according to the statement, was $18,945,000. All these banks, the sub-treasury statement showed, had previously received deposits of government money. Mr. Untermeyer was trying to bring out that some of the so-called Morgan banks received deposits. The list furnished by Mr. Steele included the First National, the National City, the Hanover National, the National Bank of Commerce, and several others, which Mr. Untermeyer noted as having Morgan affiliations. Mr. Cortelyou said that he had not been aware that the banks under Mr. Morgan's guidance had loaned money on the stock exchange in proportion to the amounts they received from the government, but Mr. Steele testified that Morgan brokers had been sent to the exchange to announce that money was available and to say at what banks loans could be obtained. Mr. Morgan, Mr. Cortelyou conceded, was, quote, the leader of the movement, end quote. So pretty much what you have here is the government deposited $29 million into the banks, which were mainly Morgan banks, and J.P. Morgan told the president of the exchange to announce a $25 million loan. But the amount that was actually loaned to the exchange was only $18,945,000, meaning over $10 million that the government gave to the banks to help in the crisis stayed in the banks. And yet J.P. Morgan is hailed as a hero through these events. And as we saw, these events would lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve, which was secretly drafted in November of 1910 at a private resort owned by J.P. Morgan. Now let's go back and have a look at Paul Warburg. He was one of the younger brothers of Max Warburg, who at that time was the head of the family, as well as being head of Germany's largest bank, M.M. Warburg & Company. And the building pictured here has been the family bank's headquarters from 1867 until today, as the Warburgs are one of those centuries-long banking dynasty families. with M.M. Warburg and Company being originally founded in 1798 by the brothers Moses Marcus and Gerson Warburg. And by 1914, or the outbreak of World War I, M.M. Warburg was the leading German commercial bank. And we see that both Felix, another of the Warburg brothers, and Paul married into the Kuhn-Loeb banking family, with Felix getting married to Frieda Schiff, who was Therese Loeb Schiff's daughter, and brother Paul getting married to Nina J. Loeb, who was Therese Loeb Schiff's half-sister. And in Kuhn-Loeb we see another one of these century-long banking families, until 1977, when they would merge with Lehman Brothers. And in the following years, after a series of other mergers, they would find themselves the odd man out when the financial meltdown happened in 2008. Anyways, I find it pretty interesting that back in 1910, it was the Warburg family that was drafting plans for what would eventually become the Federal Reserve. Now let's have a look at that original meeting back in November of 1910 and see who was there. And from the federalreservehistory.org page, we can see the meeting took place from November 20th to November 30th, 1910. And the 6 men that attended that drew up the plans for what would become the Federal Reserve were Nelson Aldrich, A. Piatt Andrew, Henry Davison, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, and Paul Warburg. And remember, it would take another 3 years and 1 month before it became law on December 23rd, 1913. But its true origins and the participants were kept secret and hidden from the public until the 1930s. And here's the picture of J.P. Morgan's private resort on Jekyll Island. And here's who these 6 guys were. Nelson Aldrich was a senator for 30 years, from 1881 to 1911. A. Piatt Andrew, who would go into Congress for 15 years, from 1921 to 1936. Frank Arthur Vanderlip was the National City Bank president from 1909 to 1919, and previously was Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury from 1897 to 1901. Arthur B. Shelton was the Secretary of the National Monetary Commission from 1908 to 1910. Henry Pomeroy Davison was a partner at J.P. Morgan and Company from 1908 to 1917, and no doubt he's there to ensure J.P. Morgan's interests. And then of course there's Paul Warburg, who would go on to become the Vice Governor of the Federal Reserve Board from 1916 to 1918, after being a member of the Federal Reserve Board immediately after its creation from 1914 to 1916. And it was Paul Warburg and the J.P. Morgans who were secretly leading the drive that led to the foundations of creating a central banking system in the United States. And considering Paul Warburg's family background, I find it pretty interesting indeed. And perfect timing too, as the Federal Reserve System was put in place about 8 months before World War I would start. And of course this didn't do Germany much good. Nor would it matter for J.P. Morgan Sr., who would die before realizing his dream of a Federal Reserve System, and he wouldn't end up seeing all the chaos and riches to be won in the coming years in World War I. But his son, J.P. Morgan Jr. certainly would, as we're going to see. Because just like when Junius Spencer Morgan died, and everything went into J.P. Morgan Sr.'s name, when J.P. Morgan Sr. died, everything went into J.P. Morgan Jr.'s name, including a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. And like I say, with World War I right around the corner, we'll have a look at what he was up to as it happened. But before we close out this chapter, I'd like to show you something that I came across while I was doing the research for it. In early 2020, M.M. Warburg is being caught up in a scandal. Max Warburg Jr., who is the grandson of Max Warburg of the early 1900s, has been raided by authorities 3 times in a scandal worth over $10 billion, and also involved apparently are Deutsche Bank and Barclays. And if you're following the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell story, the inclusion of Deutsche Bank might perhaps raise an eyebrow, but it certainly won't come as a surprise. And by the time we're finished this entire series, you'll probably agree with me that none of this should come as an actual surprise.